Water doesn't announce itself the way fire does. There's no smoke to warn you, no smell that makes your body flinch before your mind catches up. It just rises, quiet, patient. And by the time 71-year-old Eleanor Carver understood how high it had already climbed inside her own barn, it was up to her chest. And the horse trembling beside her in the dark was the only thing standing between her and a current that wanted to take her under for good. Rosie didn't know how to swim. She'd never once been taught. All she knew, in that final terrifying stretch of her life, was how not to let go of the woman who had loved her for 16 years. Have you ever had a single moment where the only thing keeping you alive couldn't even speak to tell you it would be okay? Stay with me, because this is the story of that night. But it's also the story of everything that came before it. The 16 years that built a bond strong enough to survive a flood, and the years that came after, when an old woman had to learn how to keep living in a life that flood had rearranged completely. Eleanor lived alone on 60 acres just outside a town so small it didn't have a single stoplight, only a four-way stop sign and a little white church with a bell that hung slightly crooked in its tower. Her husband, Walt, had been gone 11 years by the spring this story happened, taken quiet and sudden by a heart attack in his sleep, leaving behind a farmhouse built for a family that had shrunk down, over the years, to just one woman and whatever animals still depended on her for their next meal. Most nights, the quiet of that house didn't bother her anymore. She'd made peace with it slowly, the way you make peace with an old ache in your knee. You don't like it, but you learn to walk with it. Her daughter called most Sundays from 3 states away. Her son sent a card every Christmas, always a week late, always signed the same way his father used to sign things. Neither of them lived close enough to come running if something ever went wrong out there, on that farm. And some quiet part of Eleanor had always suspected that eventually something would. She just never imagined it would be the river that finally came for her. Rosie had come into Eleanor's life 16 years before that flood, a lanky, nervous 3-year-old quarter horse nobody wanted at the county auction because she flinched at every loud noise and fought like her life depended on it. Whenever anyone tried to load her into a trailer, Walt bought her anyway. He never fully explained why, just said something about the way she kept looking back at the other horses being sold off one by one, like she understood exactly what auctions like that usually meant for animals nobody bid on. He brought her home in the back of his old Ford, ears pinned flat the entire ride. And Eleanor remembered standing in the gravel driveway that evening watching this terrified creature step down onto ground she'd never once touched in her life. Eleanor had lost her own mother just 3 weeks earlier, a grief she hadn't told a single soul how deeply it had hollowed her out, and something about watching that frightened animal made her think, well, we've got 2 scared things living on this farm now. Maybe that's exactly why the bond between them grew the way it did. 2 creatures who showed up broken at the very same time, in the very same place, with nobody around to explain themselves to but each other. The vet who came out that first week told Walt plainly that he'd wasted his money, that a horse this skittish, this shut down, would likely never be worth much of anything. Not for riding, not for showing, not for breeding. Walt just nodded along politely and kept right on feeding her by hand every morning anyway, a little further from the fence each day, until Rosie finally worked up the nerve to close that distance herself. Eleanor remembers watching from the kitchen window in her housecoat, coffee going cold in her hands, half convinced her husband had lost his mind over an animal that flinched at its own shadow. She didn't yet understand that she was watching the exact same patience that would one day be turned on her. In her own darkest year, by that very same horse. It took nearly 6 months before Rosie would stand still long enough for Eleanor to brush the mud out of her coat, without bolting sideways. It took a full year before the mare would rest her head against Eleanor's shoulder on her own, unprompted, unasked. But once that wall came down between them, it never went back up again. Rosie became the animal who waited faithfully at the fence line every single morning, rain or shine or bitter cold, ears pricked forward, eyes fixed on the porch door until Eleanor's silhouette appeared in the frame. She became the one who let out a low, worried nicker whenever Eleanor's voice cracked with a sadness she thought she'd been hiding well enough. Walt used to tease his wife that the horse loved her more than he did, and Eleanor used to tease right back that at least the horse had better table manners. There was a particular smell Eleanor came to associate with those years. Sweet feed and cedar shavings and the warm, earthy scent of a horse's coat after it had been standing in the sun all afternoon. She'd close her eyes, sometimes just to breathe it in, standing at the fence with her hand resting flat against Rosie's shoulder, and feel something in her chest loosen that nothing else in her life seemed able to reach. Her daughter used to joke, back when the kids still lived at home, that their mother talked to that horse more than she talked to either one of them, and Eleanor never once denied it. There are things you can say to an animal, she told her daughter once, that you can't quite say to a person, because a person will try to fix you, and sometimes all you need is somebody to just stand there and listen. When Walt passed, it was Rosie who stood beside Eleanor at that same fence line for nearly 3 hours the morning after his funeral, saying nothing, needing nothing in return, offering only the particular stillness animals seem to understand instinctively about grief, better sometimes than people do. Eleanor has said more than once since that she genuinely does not know how she would have survived those first raw months of widowhood without that horse's shoulder to press her forehead against on the mornings the house felt too empty and too quiet to bear. The years that followed settled into a gentle, familiar rhythm. Feed at first light, before the sun had fully cleared the ridge line. Check the fence for downed branches after every storm. Ride out slow along the tree line most evenings when the light turned gold. 2 old souls moving at exactly the same unhurried pace, needing no destination beyond each other's company. Rosie's coat had grayed some around the muzzle by then. Eleanor's hands had grown stiffer some mornings, slower to close around the reins. Neither of them was young anymore. Neither of them needed to be, not for what they still had together. Then came the spring. The rain simply refused to stop. It began, innocently enough, as an ordinary storm warning on a Tuesday afternoon. The kind Eleanor had heard announced on the radio 100 times before without giving it a second thought. But this storm didn't pass through overnight the way Kentucky storms usually did, blowing in loud and blowing right back out by morning. This one sat directly over the county for 3 straight days, dumping rain in gray. Relentless sheets so thick you couldn't make out the barn roof from her own kitchen window. By Thursday evening, the local radio host's voice had lost its usual easy drawl, reading out road closures with an edge Eleanor hadn't heard from him before. By Friday afternoon, the Kentucky River, usually a lazy, muddy rib and a half mile off from her property line, the kind of river you'd let a child wade into on a hot day, had swallowed the entire low pasture whole. Eleanor should have left right then. She knows that now, has said it to herself 1,000 times since. Her neighbor Dale drove by around 6 that evening, leaning on his horn, hollering out his rolled down truck window that the county was calling for evacuations along all the low ground. that she needed to get out while the roads were still passable at all. Rain hammered the roof of his truck so hard he had to shout twice just to be heard, water already running in a thin brown sheet across the road behind him, like something spilling out of a tipped-over bucket. She told him she just needed 20 minutes to load Rosie into the trailer, and she'd follow him straight out behind him. Dale hesitated in that driveway a moment longer than he should have, some instinct in him not fully trusting the sky above them. But Eleanor waved him on with a confidence she didn't entirely feel herself, and he finally pulled away down the gravel road, taillights swallowed quickly by the rain. She would think about that hesitation of his for years afterward. The version of that night where he'd simply refused to leave until she was in the truck beside him, where none of what came next ever had the chance to happen at all. 20 minutes was all it took for absolutely everything to change. The water came faster than anyone had predicted. Faster than the weatherman on the evening news, faster than the county sirens finally wailing to life, faster than an old woman's cold, stiffening hands could work a trailer latch in pitch darkness. By the time Eleanor wrestled the barn doors open, the yard that had only been merely wet an hour earlier was now running with a current strong enough to knock a grown man clean off his feet. The trailer sat half submerged already, completely useless, and Rosie, sensing the danger long before Eleanor's own mind had caught up to it, was screaming, an animal sound Eleanor had never once heard her make in 16 years, high and desperate and utterly raw, bouncing off the barn's tin roof like something out of a nightmare. Eleanor waded in anyway. She wasn't about to leave that horse behind in a collapsing barn, not after everything the two of them had carried each other through over 16 years. The water hit her knees by the time she reached the stall door. It hit her waist by the time she wrestled the latch free, and it was climbing past her chest by the time she understood, with a sudden, sickening clarity, that this water had somewhere else it desperately needed her to be, and it didn't much care whether she made it there alive. That's when the barn itself began to groan. Old timber doesn't hold up well against the crushing pressure of a flood, and this barn, built decades earlier by Walt's own father, long before either Eleanor or Walt had even met, had never once been tested like this. Eleanor heard the support beam on the north wall crack somewhere directly above her head, a sound like a rifle shot swallowed whole by rushing water, and she understood in that single instant that the entire structure around them was beginning to fail. She screamed for help she already knew wasn't coming. The nearest neighbor sat a half-mile off through water that had turned far too dangerous to cross on foot now, assuming he'd even heard her cries over the roar of the storm at all. Her cell phone sat dead and useless somewhere back inside the farmhouse. There was no truck close enough, no rope thick enough, no ladder tall enough to reach them. There was only her and the horse, and black water that had already claimed the very ground beneath both their feet. This was the exact moment Eleanor Carver understood, with a terror that still visits her in dreams, that she might genuinely die inside that barn. The cold had already worked its way past her skin and into her bones, a deep, aching cold unlike anything she'd felt before, the kind that makes your teeth chatter without your permission, and your thoughts start slipping sideways. Somewhere above the roar of the water, she could hear the wind tearing at loose boards on the roof, a high, thin shrieking sound that seemed almost human. She thought of Walt, gone 11 years now, and wondered with an odd detached clarity whether this was how it would feel to finally join him. She thought of her children, states away, sleeping soundly, utterly unaware their mother was fighting for her life in the freezing dark. She thought, absurdly, Of the pot roast she'd left half, prepared on the kitchen counter that very morning, as if some stubborn corner of her mind still refused to accept how serious this had truly become. And she thought of Rosie, trembling violently beside her now, the water climbing past both their waists, the mare's eyes gone wide and white, rimmed with a fear Eleanor had never witnessed in 16 full years of knowing her. For one brief, shameful second, Eleanor considered letting go of the stall door and simply swimming for the opening on her own, some ancient survival instinct in her whispering that she might make it out alone if she stopped wasting precious seconds trying to save a horse that outweighed her by 10 times over. She hated herself for that thought even as it passed through her, and she has never told another living soul about it until now. It would have been the easiest thing in the world, in that exact moment, for Rosie to bolt. Horses caught in flood panic have been known to trample the very people trying desperately to save them, driven by pure animal terror into a survival instinct that leaves no room whatsoever for loyalty. Eleanor braced herself for precisely that outcome, half expecting to be knocked under the surging water and never come back up again. Instead, Rosie did something Eleanor still cannot fully explain. Not even all these years later, not without her voice catching somewhere deep in her throat. The mare stopped thrashing entirely. She turned her whole body in that narrow, flooding stall, pressing her flank hard against the wooden wall, angling herself low and impossibly steady in a way that made no logical sense for an animal fighting simply to keep her own head above rising water. It took Eleanor several precious seconds to even understand what Rosie was doing. She was making herself into a step. She was offering her own trembling body as the only ladder left standing in a barn that was actively coming apart around them. Eleanor grabbed a fistful of soaked mane with hands that had already gone numb from the cold, and Rosie held herself perfectly, impossibly still, muscles locked, legs trembling violently beneath the strain, while an old woman hauled herself up onto the back of a horse that could have easily lost her footing in that current and drowned them both in the attempt. The water sat at Eleanor's chest, even sitting upright on Rosie's back now. That's precisely how high it had climbed. And somewhere directly above them the barn roof let out another long, splintering groan that told them plainly they had seconds left, not minutes, before the whole structure came crashing down. Rosie moved. She didn't run. Running simply wasn't possible in water that deep and that violent. But she pushed forward with a strength Eleanor hadn't witnessed from her in years, forcing her way toward the wide barn doors that had already blown open in the wind. The current waiting outside proved worse than inside, a brown, churning debris-choked river running where a gravel driveway used to sit, carrying fence posts and feed buckets and pieces of somebody else's roof past them, like driftwood on its way downstream. Eleanor clung tight to Rosie's neck and felt the mare's entire body straining beneath her, fighting a current that wanted badly to sweep them both sideways toward the low culvert, where the water ran deepest, fastest, and most deadly. At one point, Rosie stumbled badly. Her back legs went out from under her entirely on ground that had turned to churning mud, and for one horrifying, endless second both of them went completely under. Water closing hard over Eleanor's head, cold and black and roaring in her ears like something alive. She came up gasping desperately for air, still somehow gripping that soaked mane with fingers she could no longer feel, and felt Rosie scrambling furiously beneath her, fighting with everything left in her body to find footing again in a world that had turned entirely, completely to water. Please, Eleanor remembers whispering into the mare's soaked neck, not even certain anymore whether it was a prayer meant for God or for the animal carrying her through the dark. Please, girl. Please don't you let go of me now. Rosie found her footing again. She always did. For what felt to Eleanor like an hour, though it was likely closer to 15 agonizing minutes, the mare carried her through water that should have killed them both twice over. Navigating carefully around a fallen tree trunk, around the twisted, jagged metal of what used to be someone's carport roof, around a current that kept trying relentlessly to drag them sideways toward the deepest, most dangerous part of the flood. At one point, something solid struck Rosie's shoulder hard enough to make her stagger, a piece of fence rail spinning past in the dark, and Eleanor felt the mare's whole body flinch and absorb the blow without breaking stride, as if she'd simply decided pain was something to deal with later. The rain never once let up. It came sideways in the wind, stinging Eleanor's face. Mixing with the tears, she didn't even realize she'd started crying somewhere back in that collapsing barn. Twice she heard her own name carried faintly on the wind. Dale's voice maybe, or maybe just the storm playing tricks on an exhausted mind. And both times she opened her mouth to call back, and found she no longer had the strength to make a sound louder than a whisper. Eleanor stopped being able to feel her own hands somewhere in the middle of that crossing. She stopped being able to think in complete sentences at all. Her entire world narrowed down to nothing but the feel of wet horsehair pressed against her cheek and the rhythm of a heartbeat beneath her that simply refused to give up. Higher ground appeared like something straight out of a fever dream. A small rise near the county road where Dale's truck sat idling, headlights cutting sharp through the driving rain, the man himself standing at the very edge of the water hollering Eleanor's name out into the storm at the top of his lungs. Rosie found strength from somewhere Eleanor still cannot fully explain and pushed through that final stretch, breaking free at last of the current's brutal pull, climbing up onto solid ground on legs that were shaking so violently they very nearly buckled beneath her. Eleanor slid off that horse's back and collapsed right there in the cold mud, sobbing in a way she hadn't allowed herself to since standing at Walt's graveside 11 years earlier. And Rosie stood over her, soaked through and trembling and utterly spent, lowering her head to press her muzzle gently against Eleanor's shoulder. Exactly the way she had the very morning after that funeral, all those years before. Dale got them both loaded into his truck and drove them to safety through roads that were rapidly disappearing behind them. The barn, Eleanor learned 2 full days later once the floodwaters finally receded enough for anyone to get back onto the property, had collapsed entirely sometime that very same night. Timber and stall, and every square foot Eleanor had waded desperately through, simply gone, folded flat under the crushing weight of the flood. If Rosie had hesitated even a few minutes longer in that stall, if she'd panicked instead of steadying herself against that wall, if she'd simply done what every survival instinct screaming through her body was telling her to do, and bolted alone into the dark. Eleanor knows, without a shred of doubt, that she would never have made it out of that barn alive. She lost nearly everything else in that flood. The barn itself, half the fencing that had stood on that property for generations, the equipment shed, along with years of tools that had once belonged to Walt and to his father before him. The insurance check that eventually arrived months later covered only a fraction of what had been lost, and at 71 years old, Eleanor made a decision most people her age would never have found the heart to make. She sold it. All of it, every acre that could legally be sold, every surviving piece of equipment, pieces of a shared life she and Walt had spent over 4 decades slowly building together, one season at a time. She kept the farmhouse, and she kept Rosie. She has said many times since that she would gladly sell every single other thing she still owns all over again, without a second thought, if it meant keeping that horse standing safely in her pasture for even one more year. Her son flew in from out of state the following week, took one look at the wreckage that used to be the barn, and gently suggested it might finally be time for his mother to move somewhere smaller, somewhere closer to family, somewhere without 60 acres and a horse to look after at her age. Eleanor listened to the whole speech without interrupting, and when he finished, she simply told him she'd think about it, knowing full well she never would. She wasn't leaving the ground her husband was buried under, and she certainly wasn't leaving the horse who just carried her through the worst night of her life. Her son didn't bring it up again after that. People who hear this story sometimes ask Eleanor whether she truly believes Rosie understood what she was doing that night, whether there was some genuine conscious choice happening inside that animal's mind, or whether it was simply instinct, nothing more than muscle memory, a trained response to a familiar hand reaching out in the dark. Eleanor never bothers arguing the science of it with anyone. She wasn't there for the science that night. She was there for the feeling of a body going still and steady beneath her in the middle of chaos that should have made any animal on this earth think only of saving itself. She was there for the choice, and to her, even now, it will always be a choice, of an old mare who could have easily run, and instead chose to stay. These days, Rosie is well into her 20s, gray in earnest now around that soft muzzle, moving considerably slower through the pasture than she once did in her prime. Eleanor rides her far less often now, mostly just walks quietly alongside her along the fence line in the evenings, the same way she used to walk beside Walt all those years ago. She talks to that horse the way some widows talk to a spouse who's long passed on, telling her about the weather rolling in, about her grandchildren growing up too fast 3 states away, about whatever new ache has settled stubbornly into her joints that particular week. And every single evening, without a single exception, Rosie meets her at that same fence gate, ears pricked forward, exactly the way she always has, exactly the way she did on that very first frightened night she ever came home, and became, somehow, against every early sign that suggested otherwise, the one thing Eleanor came to trust more than anything else left in this world. Eleanor says plainly that she doesn't know what still waits for either of them in whatever years remain ahead. She's 78 years old now. Rosie certainly won't live forever, and some mornings Eleanor catches herself quietly dreading the day she'll wake up, and that familiar gray head simply won't be waiting at the fence anymore. She's made her peace with that dread the same slow way she's made peace with everything else the years have taken from her, one quiet morning at a time, one more cup of coffee drunk alone at the same kitchen table where Walt used to sit across from her. But she says the flood taught her something she carries with her every single day since that night, something she didn't fully understand until she was 71 years old and clinging to the back of a horse in water that wanted to drown them both. She says love, the real kind, the kind that actually costs you something, doesn't stop to ask whether the timing is convenient. It doesn't pause to weigh the odds or count the cost before deciding whether it's worth the risk. It simply presses itself hard against the wall in the middle of the storm and holds perfectly, impossibly still, so that something else it loves has a way to climb up onto its back and survive one more night. She thinks about that lesson often now, sitting on the porch in the evenings with a mug going cold in her hands, watching Rosie graze slow and easy in the last of the pasture that's still hers. She thinks about how close she came to losing everything in one single night, and how the one thing she was most afraid of losing turned out to be the very thing that saved her. She doesn't need a barn full of tools to remind her of that. She doesn't need 60 acres, or the equipment shed, or any of the things the water carried away that spring. She just needs that gray head lifting at the sound of the gate every single evening, for however many evenings they still have left together. So before you go tonight, I want to ask you something honest. Has an animal in your own life ever shown up for you in a moment you needed them most? A moment you never expected, never once asked for, but have never once forgotten since? And if that animal is still with you today, have you told them, in whatever small way they'd understand, exactly how much they still mean to you? Tell us down in the comments below. We read every single one of them, and we know so many of you are carrying a story just like Eleanor's tonight. A story about a dog, a horse, a cat who loved you exactly when you needed it most, and never once asked for anything back. And if stories like this one touch something real in you, if you believe, like we do, that the bond between a person and their animal is one of the purest and most honest things left in this world, then go ahead and hit that subscribe button right now, because we bring you a brand new story just like this one in every single video we make, and we would be truly honored to have you with us for the next one.